So thank you all for coming. I'm sure most of you were here this morning for the 9 a.m. session where I gave a talk about content strategy and control. For those of you who weren't there, I talk quite a lot about the organizational issues that make some of the content work that I do and that some of you might do challenging. Today, or this afternoon, in this session, we're going to talk a lot more about content modeling, which is kind of one of those nitty-gritty specialties that I really enjoy doing, and I think some of you might enjoy or probably already do some form of. And I'm going to talk a little bit about where this fits into content and UX work and why it's something that's so powerful, particularly right now. So, and just so you know, actually before I get going, there are some worksheets that are in the center of the tables. You don't need to worry about them now. It'll be a little while before we get to the first activities. But those will have everything that we're going to do on them. There's some URLs on them too, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to have a bit.ly link I'll show you if you want to pull that up online so you can click the URLs instead of trying to retype them. But there will be a lot of group work and kind of conversation today. We have about 90 minutes, so there's going to be a mix of like I'll talk about some stuff, and then we'll do some stuff, and then we'll talk about some stuff. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to start out by talking a little bit about sort of why it is that content modeling is important and what it is that I mean by that. And I got interested in this as I started trying to think about mobile. I started trying to think about trying to get content onto lots of different devices. I started trying to think about all of the problems I was having with content that was not really designed for small screens. And it just felt like the more content we were dealing with, the more problems that we had. The more that we were trying to keep up with all these devices, the harder it got, the more overwhelming it got. So when I started looking into this and thinking about this, I started thinking about all these stats, right? You see these things that get blown around. This is from a Pew study. Pew Internet Project does a lot of really great research on how people use the internet. So they're saying about 57% of US adults use their phone to go online. This was as of May 2013. They'll probably produce some new stats really soon. But that's already, so 57%, more than half, were using their phone to go online then. And then you've got things like tablets. 43% have a tablet or an e-reader. That's again from Pew, it's from September. And so we know, I mean, like, we all have these devices, and it's not just us anymore. It's not just early adopters anymore, right? It's everybody. And then I started thinking about this stuff. I started thinking about all these weird web-enabled services out there, whether we're talking about the Nest, which Don was talking about in his talk yesterday, or we're talking about all these, like, is it the internet fridge or a web-enabled car, whatever it is. All these different devices are coming out that are connected to the internet. Now, some of those devices are probably really dumb. Some of them are things people don't really need. Some of them are things that seem like a cool idea but won't really take off. But what they do tell me is that we're just going to see more and more of this, right? We're going to see more and more web-enabled stuff on more and more different kinds of screens or things that don't even have screens. And it just gets more complicated and more overwhelming to think about getting information to all the different places it might need to go. So I was listening to a talk a few months ago at UX Week, which was last August in San Francisco. And it was a talk from Marissa Gallagher, who works at CNN Digital. And she was talking about this massive redesign project they were going through. It was a responsive redesign. So responsive design, right? It's supposed to solve these problems. They were trying to figure out how they could solve for all of these different devices in this one site. And also they were building a bunch of different apps. They have all this different stuff that's going on at CNN. And CNN is known for breaking news, right? That's their whole brand. It's breaking news. And so what they needed to be able to do was position their content in a way that reflected who they were everywhere. So she said being everywhere is challenging. We want people to feel like they experience the same news stories everywhere. Because whether you're looking at a phone or a desktop or whatever, CNN equals breaking news. So we need to make sure that that is what's happening in all these different devices. It's really hard. So when I hear people like this, and when I see all of these different devices that are coming out, I start thinking about this idea that a lot of organizations are trying to create separate mobile experiences, separate this, separate that, and try to manage multiple sets of content to deal with it. And I don't think that that's going to work, because it's already so overwhelming. What happens when you get to more? If Marissa at CNN is already like, oh my God, this is hard, what happens when there's twice as many devices, 3 times as many devices? How do you keep up? And so instead what we need to be thinking about is content that does more. And that's why I start talking about content modeling. Content modeling is a way that we start making our content do more for us. I look at that in contrast to the way most of our content is right now. This is a picture of the chewing gum wall here in Seattle, actually. And it's where there's just a whole ton of chewing gum stuck to a wall. I think a lot of our content is like that, like kind of gross. Maybe not, and somebody didn't think about it that long. And it got stuck to a place, right? Somebody said, okay, we need to make a web page. Well, make my little web page, stick it on the website. And so they just stuck it up there like a piece of used chewing gum, and they left it there. That's where it sits. It stays there. It doesn't move anywhere. It doesn't do anything. And it happens because so much of our content is created in systems that look kind of like this. Actually, a lot of our content is created in systems that look a lot worse than this. This one's a pretty simple example. It looks like this. And what CMS people will often tell you is like, no, but this CMS is great because you can do anything you want with it. You have this big box, and you can put anything you want in there. And in there, you can make it bold, and you can change the colors, and you can do anything. You have all the flexibility in the world because you can put anything in this big box, which is kind of true. You can put anything in the big box, but all you have is that. And that works okay if all you're trying to do is that. You're like, okay, content's here, content goes there. I talked about that this morning, right? Put my content here, show my content there. Done. But it starts to get weirder and weirder the more you're trying to deal with other places, right? And you're like, oh, this stuff doesn't fit. Oh, didn't really think about that. Wasn't really designed for that. And so as we're trying to deal with lots of different devices, as we're trying to deal with all this complexity to the way people experience our content and experience our services, we have to start thinking about what we have right now. When I say content is stuck, it's because we have things like this. Big blobs of text, so just pages and pages with huge paragraphs, long bits of information. We don't necessarily always have a lot of hierarchy to our content. So when we're trying to deal with small screens, if everything is the same priority, it's very difficult to know how to make that work. We have these WYSIWYG horrors. I don't know how many of you are familiar with a WYSIWYG editor. What you see is what you get, is what that stands for. A fond saying I have for that is what you see is WTF, because so often what people do in WYSIWYG editors is format stuff in all kinds of insane ways, and all of that formatting gets wrapped up in the content, and then as you try to transport it to different places, that formatting is still there, and that's how you end up with stuff that's inconsistent. That's how you end up with stuff that doesn't look right in different contexts, because somebody was trying to format it for one specific display. And then you get all these siloed pages. This, like I said, the chewing gum thing, right? You make a page and you stick it up on the website. And if all you're looking at is that page, and if all you ever need to use is that page, it might be fine. But it's not very interconnected. There's not a good way to make sense of how that exists within all the other information about your product or your service, your organization. What we need is to get to a place where we can deal with things in more modular chunks, so smaller pieces of information that we can combine and reuse in different ways. We need to be thinking about logical patterns to our content. When I say patterns, I'm thinking about ways that content typically works. We use patterns to start being able to anticipate how we can design for it. If any of you are currently using design patterns, it's kind of the same deal. It's saying our content usually looks about like this, so now we don't have to start from scratch every time. We're not saying like, okay, we're going to wait till we have all the content finalized, and then we're going to figure out how to design for all of it. We're saying content usually falls into these categories, so we just need to design for those. We need cleanly stored information. So cleanly stored meaning that we can break it out and we know exactly what it is, what we're dealing with. Big pages of stuff are very difficult to parse. It's hard to know what that is or what it means. And we also need content that's more connected. Particularly if you're trying to deal with lots of devices, then you're having to deal with things that are not like your typical main navigation menu across the top of a screen. You need other ways that people can move through information logically. So connections within the content itself, not necessarily tied to a navigation system, can be incredibly useful. So content modeling is one of the things that's very helpful for getting us there. Understanding how our content works is really what we're talking about. So do a little bit of definitional stuff here, kind of make sure everybody's on the same page about content modeling. This is a definition from a fellow named Cleve Gibbon. Cleve is a technologist, so he's definitely on the technical side, and he works with content strategists a lot. He works quite a lot on huge CMS projects, and he writes quite a bit about content modeling and structured content in general. He talks about it this way. He says it's not a sitemap depicting a top-down view, and it's not a navigation scheme. A content model is a representation of the types of content and their interrelationships. I'm going to show you an example. I'm going to show you an example of something that I think is pretty easy, because it's kind of automatic. You can easily connect to what those relationships are. This is an example of a recipe. So we all have an idea of what a recipe is, right? If I say recipe, you have a mental model for that. And there's some parts of a recipe that are absolutely intrinsic to that mental model, right? Like if you are going to look for a recipe, you're looking for a specific dish, so it needs to have a title. You're looking for ingredients. You're looking for instructions. If you do not have a dish you're trying to make, ingredients, and instructions, you don't have a recipe. But there's always other stuff, right? Like let's say you have a site that might be having things like teaser information about that recipe, the little description, like ooey gooey brownies, blah, 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 right? Or maybe you have nutritional information that talks about how terrible the ooey gooey brownies are for you. Or the yield, like this makes 3 dozen. Or that this will take 3 hours to cook, or 10 minutes of prep time. All that's additional information, right? So when you start looking at a recipe, you're not just saying, yeah, it's a recipe, it's a page. This page is a recipe. You're saying, this recipe is all of these little pieces. So that's one side of content modeling. That's kind of the micro side, saying like a recipe equals all these bits. How are we going to deal with all these bits? But a recipe fits into a system. It fits into a mental system that translates to a content system. And that's something that might look more like this. This is just one example of what you could have. It depends on what you were doing with your recipes, right? But when you think about it, let's say you had a recipe for ooey gooey brownies. You might have multiple brownie recipes, right? You might have 10 different brownie recipes. And that's a dish. A brownie is a dish of which there can be multiple recipes. You might have content about brownies. Like you might have a feature about making brownies and different types of brownies. And then all the recipes would be affiliated with that. But they also have all of these different ingredients, right? So you know that this recipe has each of these ingredients. And you might also be the kind of person who's like, ooh, you know what? I got all of this coconut left over from this like cookie recipe I made at Christmas. I want to make some kind of coconut-y thing, and you find some coconut brownies that way. So you're thinking about the different ways people might need to access information and the connection points between the different kinds of content. And then you get up to things like cuisine. So it's a dessert. And that dessert could be part of a dinner party menu that's part of this other feature. It could be affiliated with an event or a holiday. Imagine all of these guides that exist that are like 4th of July barbecue or, you know, Thanksgiving or a Christmas dinner party. Those kinds of things all get clustered together. And this is really what creates a system of content. And what's very important to think about and what's really useful to think about is that this isn't just like made up connection. This is how you would think about it as a person, right? As a human trying to understand information and make sense of what you need, you're really making a structural model that matches the mental model that people work within. You're saying, okay, this is how somebody can understand it. I'm looking for a dish to make for dessert to bring to this holiday party. I'm looking for a dish to make with this leftover coconut. Those kinds of very human questions and needs are expressed in the structural model. So what it's really about when we talk about content modeling is about finding shape for our content. It's about figuring out, what does this look like? What are the little pieces that actually make this a kind of content? With a recipe, it's pretty obvious, but it's not always as obvious with other kinds of content, and that's why our work is really important. It's also about building connection. It's about figuring out all the different connections between things. It's about understanding how something works inherently so that you can make it work like that in an actual system. So that really is what allows us to make our content more flexible and capable of going wherever we need it to. Because it's broken down into smaller pieces, it's defined so you know exactly what you're dealing with, and it gives you a set of information that you can make choices based off of. So when you're trying to decide if this is something that, you know, okay, well, we have a mobile app, and we also have, obviously, a big, huge desktop site, and we need to be able to make sure that people can get this information in both places. It might need to be configured differently. It might need to be expressed a little differently, but we can send these little chunks of content out, and they might be assembled and look different, but they'll work in both locations. So I think one of the things about content modeling is that I've had conversations with people who kind of felt like, oh, the content should own that, or IAs should own that. A lot of this stuff is very much information architecture skill. I've had people who think that database developers should own it. A lot of this stuff gets expressed as a data model, it ends up in a database. I think that one of the reasons that this stuff ends up being kind of either a turf war or just not done at all is that it kind of takes three kinds of skill. I've called them structural, editorial, and organizational skills. Labels can vary. The key is that I think it takes a few different ways of looking at things. You need to be able to look at stuff in multiple lenses. First one, so I'm going to talk about structural stuff. So structural skills like, there you go, data modeling. So data modeling isn't like a new thing. Has anybody in here been in the database development, done actual database work? Yeah, it's super exciting, huh? So like, I didn't make that up, right? Like content modeling is not like, yeah, we just discovered this new thing. No, this has existed for a very long time. Data modeling is really the prospect of, or the process of taking discrete bits of data and making sense of them, how they're going to work in a database. This is a diagram from a database modeling book. And this talks about how people are affiliated with departments that they work in. They work at various stores of that business. They have specific job titles. And it's saying, here's how that system fits together so that we know which people work in which store with which job titles at any given time. Here's the thing. Here's where content modeling differs a bit, or the reason that content modeling is sort of like a special skill that isn't necessarily only what happens in database modeling. It's people. So most of the content that we're dealing with is not this like finite, easy to parse data. It's not just, okay, dates and names, stuff that's like very much unambiguous. Content is ambiguous as hell. So when we're dealing with this human squishy sense of content, it's very difficult sometimes to kind of like put it into these little tiny boxes, right? That is not necessarily already built in. So what we end up having is we have structure to our content that's often more conceptual than it is formal. So the structure within our content isn't like dates and places, but it can still exist. It still is there if we start looking at it. And that's what brings me to the editorial side. When I talk about an editorial side, I'm talking about this. An editorial eye is what allows us to see our content differently. So having an editorial eye means that we're looking at some things. We're looking at things like this. We're looking at messaging, like what does this say? What's important about what it says? What is the key point here? We're looking at prioritization. How important is this versus that? What do we try to communicate now? Narrative forms. So editorial work means you understand that there's, different kinds of narrative, different kinds of content that exist. Even if you go to the sort of pure editorial, as in like in journalism, right? Like just think about the way that has very obvious forms to it, right? There might be, at a newspaper, let's look at the New York Times, you might have a feature story that's a profile, and that would have a very different form to it than an editorial in the op-ed section, which would have a different form to it than a breaking news story that goes on the front page. So when you have an editorial eye, when you start honing the editorial eye, you start seeing some of those differences in form. Differences that at first glance, you might say article is an article is an article, but actually if you take it a step deeper, you can see that there's more underneath. And then finally, I'm going to think about the organizational. When I say organizational here, I actually don't mean like the IA type of org. I don't mean like this goes in this category and this goes in that category. I mean, that's part of it too. That's sort of part of the structural and the editorial as well. I actually mean like dealing with organizations, dealing with people. Kind of what I talked about this morning, that when you start modeling out content, when you start breaking things down, you have to think about all of the people that got to deal with that later. Authors and editors, developers, CMS teams, translation teams. Oh my God, if you've worked on structured content across multiple languages, it is not easy. And so when we think about how we want to model information, we also have to think about all these people, because if we're not thinking about all of those people, well, the model's going to fall apart, because I can tell you that somewhere along the way, somebody there is going to not do what you think they should have done, right? And then the whole thing goes bust. So I think it's also a very important process of saying not just what's the ideal structure for this content, not just like what would be the like platonic ideal for how we structure a recipe, but also what's going to be actually viable and sustainable. Wow, if we ask our authors to turn this thing that they've been doing as one blob into like 47 discrete chunks just because we think that there are 47 awesome things we could do, are they going to do it? Are they going to freak out? Probably going to freak out. I think I would freak out if somebody asked me to do that, right? So you have to think about, okay, how deep do we want to go? What's actually most important to structure here? What are the things that are going to give us the most benefit and that we think we can actually train people on, get them behind, get them to understand and sustain, versus what are the things that are more nice to have and that'll just complicate the process? Are there things that we can do right now to make it a little bit better and put some other things into, you know, the phase 2, phase 3, and make those further structures happen later? And you have to be able to bring all of these skills together, right? It's like these 3 different skills have to all come together in order to make content modeling actually work. So that's why I'm actually really excited to come and do this at a UX conference, because I've talked to a lot of content people. And for a lot of people who've come out of content strategy, who came out of like an editorial background, some of what I'm talking about is like way new for them. And they're like, whoa, I got to do all these arrows and things and diagrams, and I don't do that. I don't do the diagrams. But we need their skills, right? Like I need those people to do this work because they have a tremendous amount of knowledge about the content that becomes valuable. When I talk to people who come out of UX, a lot of times I hear a lot more skill in IA and skill in design. And that's incredibly useful, but you want to be bolstering that by thinking about these other sides as well, thinking about the human sides, thinking about the editorial sides. So it's when we're starting to all pull that stuff together, each of us be able to bring more of those skills into our work and also look for the people we can partner with to strengthen what we produce, that we get some really valuable content models out the other side. So I want to start getting to work, though, here. I want to start talking more about where do we begin this? Where do we actually start doing this, like in your projects? And I think the first thing is being able to assess what it is that you're working with. What is the content that you're working with? And when I say that, I don't just mean the topics that you have. A lot of people are used to looking at that, especially if you do like a content audit. Be like, okay, these are the topics we cover. These are the topics we should be covering. We need content for. That's great. But not so much topics, and not just formats so much. We're talking about content types. And when I say content types, what I'm saying is, how is our content working for us? What is the thing it does? So I think about a content type as being a discrete kind of information that has a job to do. Thinking back to our recipe is doing something specific for us and for our user, right? Our recipe is the thing that they want to make. And it gives them the instructions and the information to actually produce it. Every kind of content, you want to have like a discrete type of content, it really comes down to saying, like, what is this doing? What's the purpose of it? And that might look something like I was talking about with our recipe model. You might have your page that's about a specific ingredient and talking about like how does coconut react to heat and what information do you need to know about coconut and what's the nutritional profile of coconut, and then connecting you to coconut recipes so that you understand how to work with coconut. As a home cook, maybe you've never worked with coconut before and you need to have that information. Does it matter if it's shredded or desiccated? Does that mean the same thing? I don't know. Better read that page about coconut. So that's a content type, right? That would be like an ingredient profile. Has a specific purpose. It has a specific thingness to it. And it's figuring out what those things are within your content. And that's really where you begin the process. And it's kind of squishy, right? Like there's not hard, fast rules all the time for what kinds of content types you need. It comes down to figuring out what you're trying to do. I want to go ahead and get into an activity that sort of helps to start illustrating this. And that is on your worksheets. But also, the first activity is just we're going to use marthastewart.com because I actually found a content modeling problem there when I was trying to look at a recipe recently, and it caused me so much frustration. I was like, this is a great example. So if you want to go to, and not everybody at your group needs to go to the site, but we're going to work with your tables. And so at least like 1 or 2 people at each table should go to the website. The first activity is really it's like start at the home page and there'll be some exploratory stuff. Later on, though, and the reason I put this bit.ly link up there is that there's a series of links I want you guys to look at that have longer URLs. They're all in the activity sheet, but that might be a faster way to just click through. So if you go there, you can get an online version of the worksheet. Anybody who wants that bit.ly link, make sure you write it down before I go. You got like 5 seconds. Does everybody read that? It's 1BULJXG. All right. So, activity. We're just going to spend a few minutes on this. Let me get some mad dash through content modeling because we only have 90 minutes, okay? So, we're starting out with this Martha Stewart site. And what I want you guys to do, and there's a little bit of write-up in the worksheet about what we're looking at here, is start poking around. What's going on here? What does Martha Stewart publish? What are the kinds of things that she actually has? So working with your group, you're really just going to start poking around and starting to make sense of the system of content that she has. What are you finding? What kinds of content are here? What makes them distinct or unique? So like, how are these different kinds of content distinct from one another? So like I said, we're just going to spend a few minutes on that. So go ahead and work with your groups and start jotting down your notes on the activity sheet, or if you have other paper, you're welcome to use it, about what you're finding and what you think is important. All right. We're going to pull back together now. I know that there's a lot more that you could identify here, but let's come back to the big group. I want to hear a little bit about what you guys found. So can I get a volunteer from a table to tell us, just real quick, what are some of the types of content that you noted at your table? How about folks right here? Red shirt? Yeah. Hi.
I noticed that there seemed to be, they were sort of grouping things together by like holidays and characteristics and like meal types within the recipes.
Okay.
And so again, they were sort of placing things in different categories to break that information up in very confusing.
There's a lot. I picked this site for some reasons. One of them is that there's a lot going on here, so there's lots to parse. So you mentioned holidays and events, and you mentioned meal types were a way that they broke up recipes. Now, and then you also mentioned other characteristics. What was it other?
Like within meal types, they have like easy to prepare, or I don't know, they had a bunch of them.
Right. 30-minute weeknight meals or whatever. Those kinds of collections of information. Sure. Seasonal things. Okay. What else? Any table in the back somewhere? Come on. Mm-hmm.
Being reused in different ways, depending on if you're trying to inspire somebody to create something, and then dive down deeper to the instruct, which could have video and help them sort of themselves.
Interesting. Okay, so this is a very high-level look at the modeling. As you're saying, okay, so this content is all inspirational content, and that's going to have this set of features, versus instructional content is going to have this set of features. Shop? Okay. Mm-hmm. So then there's a level of content that's down getting into the actual purchasing of products, right? So you get like product content related with that. And so I think that high level, there's some really good themes you start seeing there. And then if you started working on that further, you might break out within inspiration, there's these kinds of content that make that up. And you'd start taking that further. Okay, what else over here?
Mm-hmm. Whatever, it's like a backdoor to those same navigational sections.
Mm-hmm.
So through the Valentine, I'm seeing the recipes, the crafts you can do, and the things to buy, and the advertisements.
Right. So there's like a holiday collection of stuff around Valentine's Day, and then within that, there's different kinds of content, right?
Kind of
yeah.
That same
all those
structure.
different things. Mm-hmm. Is there any other major content types that have not been mentioned yet? Yeah, back there.
It
So she's pulling in a lot from her. Is it from a Martha Stewart Pinterest account? So how are those being used? So what are those being used in support of a broader content type, or are they being used independently of anything else?
Yeah, I'd be curious, like if she created that content and then put it on Pinterest, or is she borrowing from Pinterest?
And so what I'm wondering is, are those images, the images that are affiliated with a blog post or a recipe, are maybe coming from Pinterest, or are the images their own content on their own? Are they a type of content, or are they a piece of a kind of content?
That looks like it's part of hers, maybe.
Okay. And then in the back?
So we noticed that too.
Mm-hmm.
What we saw is it's actually links to social media, so it's adding you the ability to pin it to your own Pinterest account. So the content looks like it's hers, but she's trying to make it easier for you to pin it to your own.
To pin it. So it's really, so these are like an image of a craft project that's affiliated with the instructions for that craft project, and if you can pin that image to Pinterest from there.
Yeah, all her content.
Great.
An image of what she was wanting to do in English, and then a little short description, and the image itself has a link to social media, actually important.
Okay. So we're going to get more into that here in a second, because we're going to start talking about how these different types of content break down. But that's really an example, right? You're saying, well, you have a craft project, or whatever you decide to call this thing, right? It's a craft how-to, or whatever you decide that kind of content is. And a craft how-to always has instructions for doing it, and it always has an image, and it always has social media connections, right? So like that's what makes it a craft how-to, is to have this information affiliated with it. And that kind of makes that an entity. And so you start seeing those entities that exist. And you had one more, Perry? He's got a whole bunch of blogs.
Yeah, so, and that's all content that they have to manage.
Yes, and it's a different kind of content, right? The blogs will be, blog posts are talking about other things that might be happening that Martha Stewart's doing. The blog posts might be mentioning other kinds of content that exist on the site, but they're kind of in their own universe too, so it's another kind of content. So a few kinds that I jotted down, and these are not necessarily the kinds of content. These are just the ones that I noted and the way I thought about them. Were things like, okay, she's got recipes, she's got project ideas, she's got collections, which is what I was kind of calling, and I think she was calling also some of these things like Valentine's Day craft ideas, 13 amazing ways to make cupcakes, whatever those different things are. Those are collections of different kinds of content. She had some kind of feature-y articles, maybe in that Inspire kind of category that those folks back there were talking about. That's more of these longer, not how-to, more of these like longer pieces that were more about a topic. The blog posts, how-tos and tips, and products. Yeah, all of the stuff that's in shop. And then this is like not an exhaustive list. This is just a quick list of the different things that you might be working with. So what I want to do now that we're kind of getting the lay of the land, right? Like, okay, what am I dealing with in this Martha Stewart universe? I want to start thinking more about the defining characteristics of those kinds of content. And that's about saying what makes a kind of content what it is, and why is that? Why are those the pieces that it needs? When I was talking about a recipe, remember a recipe? Maybe you guys don't pick a recipe here in this exercise. But a recipe, I was like, okay, you cannot have a recipe if you are not giving me a dish I'm trying to make, ingredients, and instructions, right? If I don't have those things, I don't have a recipe. So think about these other kinds of content we started talking about. What do you have to have in order to have a blog post? Or one of these like craft how-to articles. What do those things take? So what we're going to start doing is we're going to start breaking down these kinds of content into some pieces. And again, we're going to work with your groups for just a few minutes, and we're going to start thinking about what those different chunks are. You might end up doing something that looks a little like this. This is a quick one I did of a blog post. I just did a quick overlay of a blog post to look at the site. When I look at a blog post on the site, my mind immediately does this. It goes, okay, these are the things I'm looking at here, right? Publication date, has a title, has a body, has a slideshow, has some categories, has some comments. Now, I noticed things like, her blog posts don't necessarily have authors. That's interesting. Lots of blogs would have an author. And in this situation, maybe they don't need them. But when you're really thinking about content structure, you're thinking about, not just what does this content inherently need, but what content does it need in this circumstance? So like Martha Stewart's recipes have more things to them than ingredients and instructions. And all of those things should be serving a purpose, right? So this is just a quick example of starting to break down content. So I want you to start looking at that as well. Start breaking down one of the content types you talked about in your group, with your group again, into its components. There's different ways you can document this, and you're not going to be doing a big documentation exercise, just jotting down some notes. But I'll show you just a couple of things that I've done to kind of just get a sense of what that looks like. This is a much more like kind of slightly visual guide. This is like a cheat sheet. It's like, I anonymized it by making it about the Widgetron 8100 Pro, which is a made-up product. But this is a kind of a cheat sheet format that I was using to help authors break down, oh, when I'm producing content about products, I need to do these things. I need to have a headline, and then I need to have like a marketing headline, then an alternate headline. The alternate headline should be easily translatable, and this should be 50 characters, and this should be 180 characters. These kind of breaking down the little rules and a quick it's like an anatomy of the content. It's like these are the anatomical parts we're dealing with here. That's one way you can do it. I've also done it in really granular ways. This is also a totally made-up one. It's of a fake magazine profile of Mick Jagger. So totally random information. If you look at it closely, none of it is real. But it's looking at it in a more spreadsheet format. So this is like literally like a requirements kind of document, right? Where it's talking about actual like max character counts, file formats that are supported. If there's an example of that kind of content, we pull an example in, like that we have a long headline. I'll tell you what it says. I'm sure you can't read it. Like there's a long headline that's like, finally satisfied, Mick Jagger talks music, love, and life at 69. And a short headline that's Mick Jagger, finally satisfied, right? So it's like, okay, what are these things supposed to be like? So these are some of the ways I've documented this kind of work before. Like I said, you're not going to make a spreadsheet in the next 5 minutes, dear God. Please don't open Excel. But I want you to start taking your worksheets that you have and start thinking about how would you chunk out that information in one of your content types? How would you think about all those pieces separately? So go ahead and start working with your group. Decide which kind of content you want to use and just start labeling out what you would break out. All right, let's go ahead and pull back together now. All right, so what I'd like to hear from a couple of groups is what you did. So can a group volunteer to tell us about the content type that they tackled and how they broke it down? I'm going to pick on people. Yeah, okay.
We looked at one of the craft recipes for the felt Valentine's Day coffee cup sleeve.
Mm-hmm.
We looked through at what the recipe parts were, and there's the title and a slideshow of things and a description. And it looks like it shows where it was published elsewhere. Like this one was published in Martha Stewart Living, so I'm guessing it was in a magazine or on a blog or maybe both. Last February, and then just the usual things you expect from a recipe, like the materials you need, the instructions. It was interesting that the tools and materials were labeled, but then nothing else was. It didn't have a separate header for instructions or anything like that. And then tags and comments further down the page.
Okay. So some interesting stuff you mentioned there. You mentioned attribution, right? So sometimes you might have a real need that you're labeling attribution. Attribution could be super important. You see that a lot of times on sites that aggregate information from other sources. But sometimes you might have a site where attribution is not like a useful chunk of content that you'd have. So it's interesting to call that out, that here she's like attributing to her own other publication. And who knows what kind of contractual requirements exist in the world of Martha Stewart that make that something that they have to do. I don't pretend to know. It wasn't linked. It just said that that's where it came from. And that sometimes gets really important when you're repurposing or reusing content so that you're being clear about when and like what the provenance of things is. Depends how much provenance matters in any given context. Did anybody else do that same kind of craft, we called it a craft recipe, like a how-to thing, right? Yeah, it is. It's basically a recipe, but for not a food item. Yeah. But is there anything that you guys did differently in yours?
So, yes and no. We kind of found a few, and we kind of went top to bottom and just wrote down what we saw. But then I started jotting down a lot of things, too, that we didn't see that are typically parts of.
Okay, like what?
We saw, the first one we saw was how to knit, and there were a lot of pictures there, including some close-ups of the needles under, go under these two and not that one. But I didn't see any videos, and I find videos very helpful in how-tos. And so that's
And she has a lot of video on the site. There's like a video section, if I remember correctly. I spent some time on the site like last week. So there's a big video section, but I'm not sure how well the videos are connected to the different places. We're going to get into that a little bit in the next exercise too.
So as we were clicking around for different examples too, you realized like there are multiple ways she presents her how-tos. So there was no congruency between them. Like one was just a list of steps, and the next one would be an image gallery that you click through with the steps. So it's a little jarring.
And so there might be reasons to have some different formats for these things. That might make sense. But I get the sense, personally, when I went through the site, is that a lot of it was kind of like cobbled together piecemeal, and then cobble that together piecemeal, and cobble that together piecemeal. In fact, in the next exercise, I'm going to tell you a little anecdote about that, which is how I came to do that exercise, where it feels like there wasn't so much planning about like, okay, we published these things, and here's how we're going to use these things. Like that process maybe wasn't part of it. You know, and that happens. Sites grow organically, right? Like, I mean, like over time, you add stuff, you change stuff, and if you're not sort of thinking about that bigger view and coming back to it, you can really end up with this kind of mishmash of stuff where it's difficult to know what you're going to get with any given piece of content. It makes it a lot harder when you have all that mishmash to then do something like, let's port this to mobile. And you're like, well, what are we porting to mobile? Oh, an unlimited number of different designed pages. Awesome. Easy. No problem. Yes? Yes. There's definitely a strong, I'm going to call it a strong advertising presence on this website. Yeah, and I think that gets really challenging. And I will tell you, I don't want to talk about the like business model that makes web advertising a thing, because like, we do not have the time. But I will say that advertising gets harder to deal with and more difficult to make sense of how you're going to make it work when you're trying to deal with all these different screens. And I know a lot of people really freaked out about mobile because like, oh, crap, how do we get these like banner ads that we've had onto mobile? Or like, how do we make mobile advertisements that are still going to make us the same money? And like, that is a thing that people have not done a very good job of figuring out yet. But they're starting to do some of that. And a lot of it, whatever you think of advertising, that's a business model for a lot of sites. And what a lot of them are starting to figure out how to do is break their content up into chunks so that when they need to, they can like slide an ad in between things. You might have seen this in articles recently too. Oh, what's the site? A lot of them are doing this where they have the long form features and they'll do kind of like a parallax thing or a sticky header thing. And as you scroll, you'll get to an ad that's kind of in the middle of the article and you can kind of keep going past it. And what they're trying to do is come up with ways to like insert advertising in places where you're going to see it but doesn't completely destroy the experience. And a lot of that really comes down to having your content broken up into some parts so that there is a place to do it that doesn't totally mess up the reader's flow. Advertising still tends to mess up some reader flow, but it's a topic for another day. Can I hear about one other kind of content that somebody broke down into some pieces? Somebody who did a different kind of content? Yeah?
We did recipes. I remember their comments interesting. Because they're maybe a little unpredictable from the organization side. Well, unless they're built in.
Online comments are kind of unpredictable. Get some weird stuff.
I think they were bringing a lot of insight in terms of the recipes. Like, oh, I replaced this ingredient with something else.
Yes. Comments can be incredible. Unlike most internet comments, recipe comments can be great because you might be sitting here, and I've done this, where I've been like, I don't actually have that one ingredient. I wonder if I could just use that other ingredient. And lo and behold, somebody already has. And then they left a comment saying like, yeah, it works fine. Or like, yeah, that was not a good idea. And then, you have some more information. So how they position comments suddenly seems much more important, right? Like comments are perhaps much more important to a recipe than they would be to like a feature article where it would just be somebody saying something racist. I'm not saying all comments are like, that's what most online comments are like. So when you start thinking about how these different things work and how they prioritize differently, right? It's different for different kinds of content. And the more that you understand how it's working, the better the choices are that you're going to make. So I want to take us into our last bit of exercise time, so we have just under half an hour left. And so we're going to start doing that connecting part, that part that I was talking about at the beginning, where it's not just about saying, okay, here's what a recipe is, but it's also saying, how does that fit into the system? What's the system that we're operating within? Because ultimately, what we're trying to do is we're trying to think of content modeling as a way to have more options, more choices for what we want to do with information. It's showing how information fits together, and it's not just like a user flow, and it's not that top-down sitemap model, which shows one way the information connects, right? Like a sitemap will typically be like, you can go to a main nav item, and then you can go to a sub item, and then you can go to a third level item. And that's one type of connection. But what we're talking about is all the different kinds of connections. There's multiple different ways you can move between information. Those are the options that we're getting. So that's when we're really looking at connecting our content types, building them together. So in that example that I had up of the spreadsheet where I said it was the fake Mick Jagger article, that's where you might be looking at something like this. You might be saying, like, okay, well, we have a feature article, like a Rolling Stone or something, right, that's about this artist. And we might also have content that's affiliated with the albums that artist has produced, or specific song recordings by that artist that are on specific albums. We might also have information about our author who interviewed and wrote that story. That person might have a bio that shows other things that they've written, right? So there's all these ways that information connects. And when we think about our content just as individual pages, or even individual pages in a main navigation system, we lose all of that richness, right? That richness is something we know exists in our heads, but it might not be expressed in how that content's actually accessible. But we're going to talk about ways that we actually can do that. If you have been on some of these Martha Stewart pages, you might have noticed some of these relationships being expressed. Like I said, most of this seems to be happening in kind of an ad hoc way on the site, not necessarily a systematic way. So that means it's a lot more manual work to kind of go in and make all these things happen. But there is some connection between things. You see those collections, right? So a collection has recipes in it. And what's connecting them? So basically that little bit that's connecting those things are a theme. Oh, these are Valentine's Day craft ideas. Oh, these are Easter dinner recipes. Okay, that's how they actually fit into this collection. That's the thing that connects the dots. And that's how you might end up with something that's quick breakfast for dinner recipes, and one of those is a Spanish tortilla with bell pepper. So this is part of a collection of recipes. That collection is quick breakfast for dinner. And you can see how those dots connect. But there's more ways than one that you might connect something to a collection, right? There's also things that are connected by ingredients. So you have a collection of recipes that are affiliated with one specific thing that they're pushing. So this is a whole collection of escarole recipes. If escarole is in season right now, here's some basics about how to prepare it or what to look for when you buy it, and a whole series of recipes about how to use it. Collections might also be connected to a specific dish. You know how there's lots of different ways that you might make one thing, for example, say pizza, right? So there's a whole collection of recipes that are all around this one dish that's sort of this quintessential dish. So those connections between kinds of information can come in a lot of different ways. And starting to think about how information connects is really what's going to allow us to get to a more systematic look at our content. How does this work? Like if we go up to kind of bird's eye view, how does this actually work? When we're doing that, that's really what's going to get us out of this trap of sort of like manually pulling things together all the time and allow us to do things that will be easier to port to a new device experience or to reuse across different places because we understand how it works. And we can say, oh, well, all of these things operate in sort of the same way, so they can all use the same template when they get over to this other app or whatever, right? Because we're starting to have a system to them. So what I want to do here is do our last activity. And what we're going to do is we're going to start modeling out some systems of content on paper. And you can make some really ugly diagrams on the bottom of the paper that you have there, any scratch paper that you have. This does not need to be formal, but start thinking about the ways that content connects. And I have some examples. I pulled these examples from some of their Valentine's Day content. That's what those URLs are. So if you can pull up, if you want to pull up the URLs easily, if you click that bit.ly link, you can grab them from there. And that's a bunch of different kinds of things. I stumbled upon this actually with a slightly different combination of stuff over Christmas. I was going to make some Christmas cookies, the like icebox cookies that you make like a basic dough and then you can put in different combinations of stuff, right? And so she had 3 or 4 different kinds of dough, and then she had some instructional kind of article things that were more about icebox cookies in general. And then there was like several recipes that were like, you should make triangular ones that have macadamia nuts in them or whatever, right? So there's all these different kinds of things. And I ran into this problem, and I was going to use that as an example, but it's a little outdated because it's not Christmas anymore. But also because they changed it, they actually kind of fixed the problem sometime in the last couple months, which was that if you got into one of these pages where it would talk about, like, make the chocolate macadamia version, it didn't link to the recipe to the dough that you needed as the base. It would be like, start with the basic blah, blah, blah dough, and no way to actually get back up a level, right, to the basics. And as I started exploring and looking through all of this, it was clear that it was just everything was kind of scattered. When what there really was a really obvious system when I thought about it. It's like, oh, information about making icebox cookies, basic icebox dough, flavored versions of that, so you can make lemon or chocolate, and mix-ins, right? And I could see how they fit together. But the site didn't make them fit together for me. The site made it a pain for me to figure out what I was doing. So I have a problem here that's sort of similar, I think you'll see as you start going through some of this Valentine's content that I found. And you'll see that there are some connections that could exist that probably don't. So go ahead and work with your group, and we're going to spend a few minutes working through that, and then we're going to regroup and talk about it. All right, let's regroup. I know you're not done. This site's got more problems than you can fix in 10 minutes. Okay, I want to hear just from a couple people some stuff that they did, and I heard something really interesting from this table over here. I heard you say some words when I walked by, which was, this is a child of that. And so I saw you talking about parent-child stuff. Can you tell me a little bit about what you guys found or what you did?
Well, we were looking at the, it's a little slow to load here.
I know, I'm sorry about the internet.
But just seeing how something depended on another thing, and so we get down to that dependency, but then trying to figure out how to get back to it is your problem. It took some looking around. And we're also doing it on mobile and desktop at the same time, instead of discovering something.
So you found the dependency, like making the filigree hearts, for example, right? So it was when you got to the ultimate parent recipe, you could get down into the different facets of it. Okay, I'm going to make these cupcakes with this frosting and these filigree hearts, but you were having a hard time getting up back to. So if you wanted to know where you would use filigree hearts, it wasn't obvious, for example. Okay. Anything else? What else did you guys find in how you looked at this as a system?
Turning into a link, which I would assume something like what you said, that would go to information on how to use eggs, but it instead goes to sort of this connected page with all the egg recipes. And so we were in the cupcakes, and we clicked eggs, and we got like quiche, and there was a big disconnect going on there.
So it might make a ton of sense to be able to click individual ingredients and look at more stuff. It kind of depends, right? But when you get to a page that has no context, like if it was a page about eggs and then also had those recipes maybe. I mean, because I've seen examples where, like, imagine it's like, you have a bunch of chicken in the fridge and you're like, okay, I'm making something with chicken for dinner. Then it might make sense to be like, I want to look at, this isn't what I really want. Let me go look at some other chicken recipes. Eggs are in kind of a lot of stuff, though. So maybe, like, I'm making something with eggs could get anything in the world. It could be kind of tough. But yeah, so there's definitely some structure in there. And part of the decision, and part of the reason that we do this work, is to make decisions about how much structure is going to be useful to a person and what somebody should be able to do or get when they click on any one of these individual things. Is there anything else that you guys found that was interesting as you started trying to figure out how this stuff fit together? Yeah?
One of the interesting aspects was the filigree chocolate heart was in the craft format, whereas the remainder of the recipes were in the recipe format. So I don't know. It also had a different name than it had in the title. So it may have existed in another recipe, and decide which name trumps which, but there was some disconnect there.
So maybe they're like, oh, we're going to use this format because this is like a tactile thing you make, and they're a little different than baking. It's almost like you're making a craft. It just happens to be made out of chocolate. But then it breaks the mold, and then it doesn't really fit into a system. Yeah, so you get into all these weird corners, right, where you're like, how do we make this work? And the more that you think about these systems working together, the more you can kind of get a better sense of what you should do or how to make choices. It's when you don't consider all of this stuff as a system, you end up with just this smorgasbord of different options and no way to really say, like, well, this format makes the most sense for this thing, or these are the formats we support. So the more that we're thinking about stuff in these systematic ways, and the more we're understanding connections between information, the more that stuff can happen automatically. You take some of the load off of people who are producing content on a daily basis to like manually put in text links to things. So that's what I see a lot of, is it's like just text links that somebody had to add in a little WYSIWYG or in HTML. And you can build a lot of those connections between information in ways that are inherent to the content. Okay, so we only have a few minutes left here today, like 10 minutes, and I want to just bring us back. When I started talking, I said that this has a lot to do with mobile. And I want to make sure we're kind of talking back about why that is. Why is this stuff so important for actually dealing with mobile? And not just mobile, but all these devices and all these channels in general. I want to talk about some examples of the ways that structured content really enables publishing anywhere, enables us publishing in a lot more flexible ways. So I'm going to run through a few different things that having structure enables people to do. One is Netflix. The reason Netflix can actually support you like browsing for stuff on the desktop, but also browsing on your TV and also all the different apps, is that they have everything in an API. So all that information about the show title and the people who are in it and the ratings and the description of it, and also the metadata that makes it say like this is a quirky independent comedy with a strong female lead or whatever, that it'll give you. It'll tell you like 47 different descriptors about it. All of that stuff, right? That exists in an API. An API is basically a system that allows one database to talk to another. So it's basically saying, here is all of our content in this structured format that you, this other system, can understand, and you can take that data. So they have everything in one place, and all of these other different systems, so every different device-specific thing that needs to support Netflix content can go suck up Netflix content from the central source and display it in ways that make sense. But they can only do that because it's super structured, right? Because every single system that needs to use their content needs to be able to know exactly what it is programmatically. A human being can't sit there and parse out what are the different pieces of Netflix content, right? That has to already be there when it gets there. It makes something like responsive design just work so much better, because when you're trying to take content that is, even if you're like retrofitting something that's for a big screen and you're trying to make a site responsive, if you're trying to build something from scratch and make it work across different sizes, having that modularity to information and knowing what modules you have allows you to break them down in interesting ways, especially things that are starting to become really common on mobile, like they call it designing on the z-axis. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the term z-axis, but it's basically saying we're not just designing like this and like this, we're also designing like this. So it's adding this other dimension, which is where things are layered. So like you might tap on something to get a layer that comes in or out. And it's allowing us to basically say, well, we only have this little screen to deal with, so we're going to manage that real estate in different ways. But if you want to have these designs where things layer in and out, where you can zoom and stuff like that, all of that relies on having smaller chunks of content to deal with, so you know what to extract, what to show when. It's what enables all kinds of faceted search. Lots of you have probably worked on faceted search stuff before. Having structure to our systems allows more things to be searched in more ways. This is an example from Zappos, which of course is very structured. And when you're thinking about products, like shoes, which come in sizes and colors, there's all this inherent structure to products. But other kinds of content can be more structured and can start having more faceted options to them when we think about them in this way. That allows us to search them and find them in situations where we maybe don't have like main navigation that allows us to get access to things. It's also really useful for feeding things like algorithms, mashups, being able to pull different sources of content together, which you probably use all of the time without even thinking about it. If you look at something like Yelp, what does that run off of? Well, Yelp has some information. They have people who actually like enter some business listings, things like that. They have actual employees who will start that process. They've got all of this user content, so you go in, you write a review about this awesome or terrible restaurant you went to. And then they also pull in all this Google Maps data, right? So they are pulling through all of this information into one listing. And that's what makes it useful. But all of that relies on them having structured content, right? Like they wouldn't be able to do any of that if they didn't have their content in a highly structured format so that they could match up a place with a review, with a Google map. So all of these different things are really things that we're using constantly. We're using structured content and other kinds of structured data all of the time. And the more that our content starts fitting into this, the more we'll start being able to do with it. Ultimately, it lets you choose what to make when, because you're stitching together information in useful ways. The more specific you are about what your content means and what it's doing, the more you can say, here's what we should pull together for this circumstance. And that's really valuable not just for mobile. It's been valuable for a really long time. It's just suddenly become so much more helpful and so much more problematic when you don't have that. So we have just a couple minutes left, and I want to wrap up, though, by talking about something that kind of brings us back to the talk I gave this morning. And that it's not just about being able to make diagrams and spreadsheets of this stuff, right? It's definitely not just about being able to model things out. Like I mentioned, it's all about what's viable and what's possible. The best content model is the thing that's going to get used. And so if we want something to get used, we can't go into it thinking that we are somehow like the superhero, we are the people who understand this stuff because we can make diagrams with arrows and boxes. We can't go in there and think that we're the only people who are part of this. Because it's really like, it can start to feel like you're trying to do this like crazy mastermind work, right? Like you're a beautiful mind and you have the entire wall covered in Post-its with arrows between them. Which is sometimes a really useful activity, but it's not about like masterminding the system, because then that's all about you controlling the system, right? What it's really about is making sure that you're having people participate in this process. It's not trying to be done by like one expert in a room. Over lunch, I was talking to a fellow who was talking about how he has a taxonomist he works with, and it's the same deal. Taxonomist he works with at his organization, and they were talking about some of the problems with taxonomy being that, people will put together this huge taxonomy that they hire some fancy taxonomist to do, and then nobody uses it, and then people are like, yeah, that taxonomy thing doesn't work. Well, it didn't work because nobody used it, because nobody wanted to use it, because it was made by some dude who didn't understand what those people do on a daily basis, right? Even if the taxonomy is great, if nobody uses it, it's shit. And that's the same for structure, right? Like, it doesn't matter how we model out our content if we can't get people involved with it. And so, like I talked about earlier, this is something that can be done by everybody. It's not something that you can just not just anybody can do like the whole process. You need specialized skills. And these kinds of skills we talked about today are very much like specialized skills that you would have as a UX person or a content strategist, for example. But some of the ideas, the inputs into the process can come from anyone. This is from a client workshop I did where this was them doing some content modeling. They were modeling out all the different kinds of news articles that their organization has, and they're kind of talking through what those things have in common and how they're different. And yeah, none of those people were experts at this, but what we had a mix. What's really useful is have a mix of people who come from kind of a structural background. So you have your people, like I talked about, your structural skills. Maybe you have your CMS team in there. If you have IAs, some developers. But you're also wanting to bring in the editorial people. So that could be people if you have specific content people. Marketing can be really important. People from user research who understand how the users think about the content. How are they thinking about your products and services? If you have people who are curatorial, people who are interested in writing and editing, you're getting those kind of editorial skills involved. And then the organizational bit, what's going to be viable? That's where I think it's useful to have people who are like project managers involved with this, or people who lead a team that might have to manage this ongoing. Or you have people who are like brand managers who understand what the brand really needs and what's important. Like, well, these things really need to be together because we're trying to do this sales goal over here. Product teams, anybody who's managing something as a product is incredibly important to this process. And when you get them together to kind of work on this, what you end up with is this really like rough look at the models, what the models could be, and you collect those up. And those become an incredibly valuable input to some of the final decisions. You don't try to make all the decisions in this big session. What you try to do is you try to get a start, and you get what's important to people, and then you can pull that together and polish it up, and that's where your expertise is really valuable, guiding people through it and then polishing it up at the end. So we're out of time now, so I wanted to thank everybody for coming to this. I'll let you know, This kind of stuff is very much what I talk about in my book. So if you did not happen to get a copy of that in any of the giveaways, and you're interested in this stuff, I have a lot more about it in there. So thank you so much for having me.